Since the arrival of President Donald Trump into the Oval Office, immigration into the U.S. has become a very difficult task, not only for those wishing to migrate permanently to the U.S., but also for those who just want to visit. Now, the issue of the so-called visa ban became one of the most controversial pieces of legislation seen in U.S. immigration history, as Executive Order 13-769 saw 11 countries banned from obtaining visas to the U.S.
This Muslim and refugee ban is unjust, it is un-American, and we will continue to fight it in the courts and in the streets to make sure that it's defeated.
However, there was no disguising the fact that the travel ban was actually, well, a hidden Muslim ban. That's what it turned out to be, as the majority of the nations that were listed on Trump's order were predominantly Muslim countries.
This is a ban on Muslims, no matter how anyone tries to explain it. National security cannot be used as an excuse for religious discrimination. We believe it is unconstitutional, and we are appalled that anyone on the Supreme Court would think otherwise.
Hello, welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavita Hawaii. In this week's show, we will be looking at how the immigration and visa restrictions imposed by Donald Trump have led to a huge problem for those who wanted to visit the U.S., as well as seeing a knock-on effect as people find alternate ways to enter the country. Please don't forget that this is your show, so why not send us a contribution? Have you been rejected entry into the U.S.? Has your business been affected by the ban? Have you been forced into the U.S. as a worker? We want to hear about all of this and more, so drop us a line by visiting us on our Twitter page using the marker @ED_program. We can't wait to hear from you. Well, with the so-called Muslim ban in place, Donald Trump has now signed an executive order that bars hundreds of thousands of foreigners seeking jobs in the U.S. by suspending worker visas. The reason? Well, Trump argues that by bringing in workers, prospects for U.S. workers are harmed in the process. One of the hardest hit industries that will suffer from this ban on imported labor will be U.S.-based technology companies and outsourcing firms that bring in some 85,000 staff per year to the U.S. However, the exploitation of the workers is something that the companies thrive on, tying the workers to their jobs, and hence allowing the companies to pay them less than U.S. employees. Now, the U.S. has been seeing a steady rise in terms of the number of people coming into the country on temporary working visas, also known as the H-1B, but at no time has the permanent leave to remain visa or green card been increased, with only 140,000 employment-based green cards issued each year, trapping some 1 million families in the U.S. unsure of their next step.
Many people from around the world see the possession of a US visa a crown jewel in their passports, with the vast majority of people managing to get one, doing so through the so-called Electronic System for Travel Authorization, or ESTA, a simple online form submitted with a small fee which smooths the process, making it an easy job for residents of certain countries. For those wishing to stay in the US, maybe as permanent residents or workers, the route was through the infamous green card process. With the scheme being so famous, it even merited a film being made of the same title, telling the tale of how a French citizen married an American woman to get the green card. Furthermore, the US have for years run a green card lottery, allowing a certain number of migrants to move to the US on a permanent basis. However, that too has now changed as the impact of Trump's policies hit the immigration procedure. The most controversial aspect of Trump's policies was the so-called visa ban, which soon turned out to be labelled as nothing more than a Muslim ban, as the names of the countries that were on the list were in majority Muslim countries, something that Iranian President Hassan Rouhani claimed was a breach of human rights.
این زیر پا گذاشتن حقوق انسان هاست. اینا میگفتن ما به تعهداتمون وفاداریم. چطور سفارتخونه شما ویزا صادر کرده، تو گذرنامه زده، امضا کرده، حالا میگی من قبول ندارم، حق نداری به کشور من سفر بکنی. تمام اصول و تعهدات بین المللی رو اینا زیر پا گذاشتن.
The introduction of the visa ban led to multiple protests against the discrimination shown by Trump and led to Americans themselves standing up and countering the measures.
We want to continue to stand up and speak out that this is not who we are, that we need to do better than this as Americans and as America. This is not what our country was founded on.
The protests on the streets were further fortified by a legal battle to overturn the ban, with those responsible for taking the motion to court, vowing to never give up the fight and to end racially and religiously aggravated decisions made by Trump.
We will continue to fight and to challenge this executive order. The administration, particularly in the campaign and since, has made very explicit that it plans to limit immigration, specifically from Muslims and from Muslim-majority countries. So that stated intent to discriminate has not changed. That intent, we can make things nicer around the edges, or make a very poorly thought out and chaotically implemented order a little nicer, but the same intent to discriminate still underlines this, and we will continue to fight it.
With the ability to obtain a visa, work permit, or permanent leave to remain in the U.S. becoming harder than ever, illegal entry or trafficking is fast becoming a popular way into the U.S. Now, according to the Department of State, some 49,000 people have been reported to trafficking hotlines since the year 2007, with this number only being the ones that they knew about. Now, rough estimates of how many people in total are actually trafficked into the U.S. claims that roughly between 18,000 and 20,000 people are smuggled in each year, with many of them being thrown into forced labor or the sex industry, adding to the exploitation of those who could not enter the country legitimately. Of the groups of people most at risk from the consequences of trafficking are children, with some 300,000 kids in the U.S. at risk from sexual exploitation. There's also the added factor that around 50 to 60% of the children at risk in the U.S. are coming from the foster care system, where traffickers are now actually targeting this, and this is the demand for sex workers in the U.S. coming from them.
The legal route into the US has become harder than ever, with the prospect of obtaining a work, visitor or study visa becoming harder than ever. The increased difficulty has led to a natural increase of trafficking people into the US, in particular to feed the demand for certain kinds of employment. Unfortunately though, the trafficking of people often leads them to being trapped in the most unpleasant of circumstances. Domestic labour, sex workers, agricultural workers and undeclared labourers are all the norm when it comes to the kind of jobs people end up with in the US, with a huge percentage of them being thrown into sexual exploitation situations. Reports by the US Department of State estimate that some 15 to 50,000 women and girls are trafficked into the US each year.
We believe that there are approximately 14 to 17,000 individuals trafficked into the U.S. every year. The data is not great, and we're really pushing the U.S. government to do more research and to get more data so that we can get ahead of the traffickers.
More worryingly, it seems that this number is still not enough, with some 67% of sexual workers in the U.S. coming from within the country itself, many of whom are vulnerable girls from foster care and are exploited due to this vulnerability.
67% of victims are local. So that's breaking the myth. This is not girls and boys coming in offshore, and that's what people typically perceive trafficking to be. This is local kids. Most of them are between the age of 12 and 18.
For the President of the United States, the problem of trafficking stems from what he believes is the internet, and not his policies of ever tighter immigration controls, nor the fact that illegal trafficking is still omnipresent in the US.
We are fighting every day to stop the tragedy of human trafficking all along our southern border. Together we will end the scourge of modern-day slavery that, because of the internet, is at levels that nobody can believe.
America has in fact undermined its own credibility by awarding itself top marks for fighting human trafficking, in spite of the country seeing an alarming decline in the number of people indicted for the offence, raising the question as to just exactly how the US could maintain the top-ranking marks, as well as asking just what are they really doing to tackle the problem.
Joining me in the studio is Bridget Anderson, a professor of migration, mobilities, and citizenship from the University of Bristol. She's the author of the book Us and Them, The Dangerous Politics of Immigration Controls, and also Doing the Dirty Work, The Global Politics of Domestic Labor. Professor, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the first question that comes to mind here is how migrant labor is one of the backbones of most developed nations' workforces. With the United States, Europe, and other nations relying heavily on such workers, why then would a nation want to put a halt on the migrant workers arriving, for example, in the U.S.?
Well, I think it's really important to say that, first of all, that not all migrant workers are banned. And we saw in the time of the sort of height of COVID that they were desperate to keep seasonal agricultural workers coming. Trump's green card ban didn't apply to low-wage migrant workers. So, you know, let's be clear that when we're talking about bans on migrant workers and stopping migrant workers from coming, actually sometimes these gestures are more symbolic than real. And I think what you can also see is there are plenty of migrants who work who are not imagined as migrant workers. So all over the world, we've seen the growth in cultural exchange and youth mobility visas, for example. So these are bilateral agreements whereby young people can come and work for 2 years in one country, and they share those young workers. So, and these people aren't really imagined as migrant workers. Neither are people on spousal visas. So I think we have to think carefully when we say, oh, they're stopping migrant workers, about who actually is being stopped.
Okay. Well, many people are unable to enter, for example, the United States and other nations legitimately. So they're looking to cross borders illegally as a result, which is, well, resulting in some people taking advantage of these vulnerable people and trafficking them. Is this something that has become worse as a result of making borders actually harder to cross legally? Yeah,
I mean, I think the borders do not stop people from moving. They actually, as I say, if we start thinking them as being productive, as making certain kinds of workers, then what you effectively are doing is illegalizing people as they attempt to move and making it very difficult for them to join trade unions, to demand equal pay, to join with other co-workers in challenging employers. So actually, I think effectively then what you have is you create a group of people whom employers have greater means of control over than they do of national workers, which of course leads to increased exploitation.
With many people, final question, having lost their jobs due to the COVID-19 virus, is stopping new workers who are arriving a tactic being used by world leaders to reinstate their own citizens back into the workforce? And will this go against the host country if this is being done or going to be done?
Well, I think, as I say, if we think about borders as effectively being ways of illegalizing people or tying them to employers, then what we can see is that rather than protecting a national labour market, they actually create groups of people who employers effectively can prefer to employ because they have greater control over them. So if we want to make the workplace a more just and fair place for workers, then we have to look at labour regulation. It's no good looking at immigration regulation as a means of protecting labour markets.
Okay, many thanks to you, Professor Bridget Anderson from the University of Bristol. It was great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're about to take a short break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere as we have plenty more coming up. We're joined by regular current affairs and impact analyst Mahan Abedin, who will be running through the events happening in the world of social media and otherwise. Also, we're going to take a look at Trump's border wall with Mexico and ascertain whether it has really managed to do what Trump has promised. And we'll be looking at how the U.S. tech industry will be affected by the downturn in foreign workers in the U.S. as talent from abroad dries up and foreign competition from China and beyond begins to shift the balance of power in the tech world. So stay right where you are. We'll be right back after this short message. Joining us now in the studios is Mahan Abedin, our current affairs and impact analyst. Mahan, welcome. The first post is very eye-opening in terms of what it reveals here.
Yes, and also quite counterintuitive, because you tend to think that human trafficking victims, those who've been smuggled across borders, they're usually tricked by organized crime gangs. And it turns out that a lot of them are actually tricked by people within their own social circle, even loved ones. So counterintuitive, but also it makes sense as well, because to actually persuade somebody to undertake that journey, a splash into the unknown, if you like, requires a degree of trust.
This particular aspect of the impact it has on a country's GDP is also interesting.
Yeah, but organized crime, as we all know, it's really big, whether it's drugs or human smuggling. And I think what we don't know, of course, is the full extent of it. Sure. For example, now, I mean, you see all these people being smuggled across the English Channel from France, and only now the British and French authorities want to get to the bottom of it in terms of identifying these gangs, their connections to the establishment, if you like.
Sure. Let's go on to the next post over here, and this concerns the U.S.
Yes, well, I mean, the United States actually has an official sanctions list, if I'm not mistaken, for countries that do poorly in terms of human trafficking. But as it turns out, the US itself has an abysmal record on this in terms of addressing the needs of victims, because let's not forget, people are smuggled across borders, usually to work as slaves, often in the worst type of industries, prostitution, the rest of it. They are victims, so they need help, they need state intervention. The US is poor on that. And the US, in addition, is also poor in terms of identifying the criminal networks, bringing people to justice, prosecutions, the whole criminal justice matrix. So they do extremely badly.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Mon Abedino, Current Affairs and Impact Analyst, with his take on this. Right now, we're going to take a look at how this impacts the tech industry in the form of foreign students who actually want to work in the U.S. However, they are meeting a huge stumbling block in the name of the U.S. President Donald Trump.
Donald Trump, it seems, will not be happy until he turns the US into a fortress United States, blocking off all entry to the country from anyone whom he deems undesirable. One of his most audacious election promises was to fortify the southern border with the US and Mexico, hailing the building of a Trump wall as a last line of defense against what Trump would surely label as unwanted migrants crossing into the US illegally. For Trump, the building of the wall came with much more controversy, as initially he stated that Mexico itself would pay for the wall, which was designed to keep the Mexicans out, proving to be an oxymoron on a monumental scale. But the question is the wall doing exactly what it says on the tin? It was designed to keep out waves of illegal immigrants to the US, in particular migrants coming from South America on foot. According to Trump, it's doing a great job, but only in order to justify his spending on the wall.
During the past 2 months, we've seen the lowest number of illegal border crossings in many years. Illegal immigration is down 84% from this time last year. Illegal crossings from Central America are down 97%.
One can only wonder whether Trump stated that the wall was a success due to the fact that it was the US that paid for it, unlike Mexico, the intended target. There is, however, a negative side to the creation of the wall and the consequences of being caught illegally in the United States, namely the separation of families and the treatment of people detained in camps created to hold illegal aliens.
My dad didn't do nothing. He's not a criminal or something. That's why the immigrants took them. Please let him free. The governments, please put your heart. Let my parents be free with everybody else, please. Don't leave the child with cryness and everything.
For the children separated from their parents, the conditions in which they were kept is also a situation that demonstrates a sheer heartlessness of the US Department of Immigration, leaving children in the most unpleasant of conditions.
The conditions are worsening because the centers are becoming more crowded. And so what we saw in the news very recently, over the last few days, is a center where children do not have, are sleeping on a floor, sleeping in cold temperatures, are not given changes of diapers, are not given changes of clothes, are not allowed to shower, are not given adequate food. These are all conditions that
Time now for the Info News section of our program, where we review some of the top stories that we see as important being from around the world. We begin first with this head-turner. The whole house of cards is going to collapse. GOP shudders a Senate with U.S. on verge of economic catastrophe. It says the magnitude of suffering in this scale is about to cause an immense pressure on the U.S. population. If relief is not given, this lapse is going to lead to evictions, to hunger, and to desperation for millions of Americans. Next, the U.S. dollar. Is it in trouble again? But to the point of no return? An ex-IMF official has said blow-up event could collapse U.S. dollar as America's debt mounts. His warning comes as the U.S. is expected to double down on its fiscal stimulus measures to soothe the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the U.S. has turned up the heat on China, and the markets have felt it. Global stocks have tumbled as China tensions escalate, while the U.S. economy continues to struggle. But this time could be worse, since now the two countries are closing their embassies, which could only mean that this is going to get a whole lot worse. So those were some of the stories. If you have a story that you would like for us to cover in your part of the world, or you just have an interest in it, please don't hesitate to send it to us at @SideED_program. That is where you can send it to. Now let's take a look at how foreign student restrictions into the U.S. hurts the U.S. tech industry and in turn the U.S. economy.
It's a proven fact that pretty much every highly developed nation has used the notion of migration to their advantage, in particular when it comes to technology, science and innovation. The US is no exception to this rule, with the likes of Silicon Valley in California bursting with talented software engineers, boffins and computer scientists from all over the world, and in particular from India, Russia and China. However, the decision by Trump to potentially put an end to working visas for talented individuals from abroad in the form of the H-1B visa could mean a shortage of staff for tech firms, and hence see the likes of China overtake the US as the world's leading nation when it comes to technology.
Fundamental issue is everyone is getting, both American companies and Indian companies are being negatively impacted, and in return it is going to negatively impact the growth story or the recovery in the US economy.
The impact will also be felt on the large American-based companies that rely on migrant talent, not only for their progress, but to best reflect the global market that they're targeting, with the likes of Google, Amazon and more, all using H-1B visa holders to play a part in their international portfolios.
When you look at the large American companies, and I'm not going to get into names, but it's all there, all of them have taken H-1B employees.
Another branch of talent that the US relies on is its foreign students, not only as a potential talent pool of future workers, but also due to the huge sums of money that they bring to the US in the form of college fees. Trump attempted to subject foreign students to deportation if they did not show up to their classes on campus, a problem that posed a huge health risk due to the impact of the coronavirus. However, in a rare policy reversal, the Trump government bowed to pressure from various universities, potential employers in places such as Silicon Valley, and from 20 states, all of who opposed the plan to deport their students and interns. As mentioned, it appears that cost was a major factor that drove Trump to reverse the decision, as it was estimated that the loss of students would have resulted in millions of dollars being lost, as well as jeopardizing the ability of US companies to employ talented graduates.
The U.S. promised the American dream to many following the end of World War II. Yet today, the story is very different, with many people being pushed into forced labor or sexual exploitation. To make matters worse, the U.S. has undermined its credibility in the global drive to end human trafficking, giving itself top marks in its annual report on the crime, despite falling numbers of prosecutions against the traffickers themselves. For those wanting to enter the U.S. legally, hold jobs and contribute to society, they too are finding themselves blocked, refused, or discriminated against as the racist white lobbyists pile pressure on the U.S. government to stop migration into the U.S., a policy that is duly lapped up by Trump at the White House. Don't forget, we want to hear about the stories that matter to you. So why not tag us in your stories by using the marker @ED_program. We'd love to hear from you, and who knows, we may just cover your story on a future show. So do write in. Remember, you can also catch up with this episode and all of our previous episodes by logging on to our website, where you can watch our shows at your leisure. That's about all the time we have for this week. I've been Kavit Tavley. And on behalf of myself and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time.